Hello, everyone, and thanks for this opportunity to deliver this paper. I was just telling Kendy that I'm in some ways maybe on my way out of the academic game. We'll see what happens. But this is it's nice to be able to be doing some of this down the stretch here. But so anyway, my paper is fundamentally about a single section in Beyond Good and Evil. In fact, it turns out both mine and Charlie's pieces are very much about Beyond Good and Evil, which is nice. Hopefully we'll have some interactions about that. But mine's about one particular section, a section in Beyond Good and Evil that's often trotted out by naturalist interpreters of Nietzsche, which is the 230th aphorism, Beyond Good and Evil 230, which makes reference to this sort of interesting metaphor, which a lot of interpreters have talked about, of translating humanity back into nature, a kind of hermeneutic metaphor for understanding inquiry into human beings. And so I'm going to focus on a different aspect, actually, of the passage, though. So it has been used as a kind of statement of Nietzsche's naturalism, that he wants to translate us back into nature, and that he's stating a kind of grand program in this section. I'm going to draw our attention to some weirder aspects of the passage, and in particular, I'm going to focus on, as my title indicates, references or allusions to a couple of Greek figures, Oedipus and Odysseus. They pop up in this section in a strange way, I think, in a way that's easy to sort of just run your eyes over and not think about much, but I'm going to try to think about them a little bit. And what I'm going to suggest, actually, is when we do pay attention to these more bizarre elements in the passage, we find out that Nietzsche's attitude toward the naturalism that he is expressing there is actually pretty ambivalent, and in some ways maybe quite negative. And because of some questions Kendy has asked me, which we'll get to later too, maybe even that he's not even fully in control of his moods or attitudes toward this naturalism. But that's for after the talk, perhaps. So anyway, the paper has 3 sections. I'm going to pay short shrift to one of them probably, and read a decent bit of the 2 latter sections. The first section is picking out a particular naturalist interpreter, Brian Leiter, a name that probably people are familiar with, but I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time probably in the paper. I explain kind of fully his view. I'm going to skip over a lot of that here and focus on my own interpretation. But I will say a few quick things about Leiter. In the second part, I'll be describing in a little bit more detail my own reading of this particular passage, and saying a little bit too about the context in which these allusions come up. And in particular, I'm going to suggest that there's, in Beyond Good and Evil 230, there's a discussion of cruelty, and especially of self-directed cruelty. And it's in that context that this topic about translating humanity back into nature comes up. And in the last section, I'm going to talk especially about a reference to Odysseus. And Odysseus with sealed up ears, Nietzsche says. So I'm going to talk about that reference a bit and argue that when we look into it a bit, it suggests that Nietzsche is warning us actually away in some ways from the naturalism he's describing, that it's actually a kind of self-directed cruelty, that it's actually of a piece in some ways with some more ascetic, life-denying kinds of impulses that he sees at work in Christianity, and of course also in inheritors of Christianity amongst secular, scientific-focused kinds of ways of thinking. So that's the kind of structure of the paper. Leiter, so I'll turn to Leiter first, and again, I want to be kind of quick here. Roughly speaking, Leiter's view about Nietzsche is that he is a philosophical naturalist, and that what that means is that Nietzsche thinks that philosophical inquiry ought to be continuous with empirical scientific inquiry. And roughly speaking, what he means by that, he's got a lot of qualifiers here, which we can talk about in the Q&A if people are interested. But that doesn't mean that Nietzsche is a materialist or a physicalist. He's not a metaphysical naturalist. He's a methodological naturalist. So he thinks that particularly the methods of science, ought to be employed in philosophy as well. And that what counts as a method in science, in the most general kind of terms, is that it seeks out the deterministic causes of natural phenomena. And so because of this, the philosopher then also ought to be engaged in this process of determining the causes of natural phenomena, and with a particular purpose in mind, that we seek out the deterministic causes of things because that allows us ultimately to diagnose and to predict what will happen, right, in the realm of phenomena, but also, of course, potentially in the end to control that, to come to a sense in which, because we can predict what's going to happen if certain causal antecedents hold, then we can determine what will happen by intervening in various ways, and we can control the world of natural phenomena to a large degree. And so that, fundamentally speaking, that kind of idea of naturalism is what motivates Leiter's reading of Nietzsche, and it motivates his reading of this passage that I want to focus on. So I will, hopefully it worked just a moment ago, hopefully it'll work again here. I'm going to share on the screen the key passage, and I'll read it out, because why not? So there's a reference here at the beginning. This is excerpted from the end of a very long section. I'll talk about that some a bit later. But a reference here at the beginning to the terrible basic text of Homo Natura must be recognized even underneath these fawning colors and painted surfaces. I may talk about what those are a little bit later. To translate humanity back into nature, to gain control of the many vain and fanciful interpretations and incidental meanings that have been scribbled and drawn over that eternal basic text of Homo Natura so far, to make sure that from now on, the human being will stand before the human being, just as he already stands before the rest of nature today, hardened by the discipline of science, with courageous Oedipus eyes and sealed up at Odysseus' ears, deaf to the lures of the old metaphysical bird catchers who have been whistling to him for far too long. You are more, you are higher, you have a different origin. This may be a strange and insane task, but it is a task. Who would deny it? Why do we choose it, this insane task? Or to ask it differently, why knowledge at all? Everyone will be asking us this, and we who have been prodded so much, we who have asked ourselves the same question 100 times already, we have not found and are not finding any better answers. And then it ends. That is the end of the section. So the suggestion, of course, of the ... there is that I've cut out the end, perhaps, but I haven't cut out the end. That is the end of the section. And then the next section continues on in a way that might or might not be interpreted as the answer to the question that the ellipses suggest there at the end. I'm not going to talk too much about that, although again, that's something we could look at later. But that's the passage. And so Leiter is in particular keen to emphasize this reference to discipline. So Nietzsche says there that we should look at ourselves the way we look at the rest of nature, hardened by the discipline of science. And so he suggests that's an expression there of methodological naturalism. We should look at ourselves with the same methods that we use to look at, billiard balls on the table, or subatomic particles, or whatever. And he also suggests here that Nietzsche's talking with us about the sort of origins of human beings. He suggests there's a reference here to other contemporary naturalists and indeed materialists of Nietzsche's day. He picks out a particular one named Georg Büchner, who's an important, or sorry, I meant to say Ludwig. Ludwig Büchner. Georg Büchner is the literary figure. Ludwig Büchner was a popular science writer kind of the day, a materialist, who writes that the researches and discoveries of modern times can no longer allow us to doubt that man, with all he has and possesses, be it mental or corporeal, is a natural product like all other organic beings. And so Leiter takes Nietzsche to be expressing a kind of agreement with that position, that advances in the sciences have shown us that human beings are natural products in the way that everything else that the sciences inquire after are. And so with some other scholars, I have my doubts actually about whether Nietzsche agrees with Büchner about this, at least if we understand it in what seems to be the natural way of understanding it, which is that claiming that scientific inquiry has somehow demonstrated to us or shown to us that human beings are natural products in this way. So I think the right way to frame this would be to say that the fact that we are natural products, if it is a fact, is more of if you like, a kind of presupposition of the kind of thing that Nietzsche is talking about here. He's suggesting, he actually uses this phrase machen das in there, that we should make it so that human beings are natural products in this sense. The idea being that that it's something we could do to turn ourselves into these kinds of beings, as it were, not just sort of something that we have to accept because science has told us, right? And so I think that's part of what's going on in the passage. And so if that's true, that raises questions, and obviously Nietzschean questions, about whether we should pursue a naturalistic project like that, right? What's the value of a project like that? What are its project like that? What are its dangers? Should we approach human beings as natural products in that way? Obviously, there are some things to be said in favor of that, right? There are values that we can realize in that way. If you can, if you can map out chains of causal determination and intervene in them in various ways, take, just the most obvious case of scientific medicine, right? If we know the causes of certain illnesses and can intervene so that those causes do not develop, we can make ourselves less sick, right? We don't need, I take it, don't need reminders of that fact at this particular moment in history. There's value, obviously there are values there that are being realized that are quite important. But of course, it's equally true that that approach can be dangerous. So if the naturalistic approach suggests to us that the thought that we can only know or inquire after aspects of humans and their behavior that are amenable to that kind of diagnosis, prediction, and then ultimately control, we run the risk of denigrating as unscientific and then valueless other kinds of inquiry that don't have those goals. And this desire for control might get out of hand as well. Again, in the paper, I refer to the case of medicine here. One issue with that, if we are focused so much on control, we run into problems like over-medication. We think that every single problem that medicine presents us with is one that we have to intervene and have a controlling agent that sort of fixes the problem. So it's a mixed bag. So whether or not we should be approaching naturalistic phenomena, approaching ourselves in this way, is an open question. I think Nietzsche means to be suggesting that here. And so I think Nietzsche's going out of his way to ask those questions in sections like this, rather than suggest that they're already settled. And so one way we can see this, I think, is by these references to Oedipus eyes and Odysseus ears. I think one's initial reaction to them ought to be confusion, actually. So if that is, you thought that Nietzsche was just saying, I'm a naturalist and here's my program. Because for one thing, we can say, why Oedipus's eyes and why Odysseus's ears? What could it mean to say that that naturalism calls upon us to approach ourselves with these things? Oedipus's eyes seem rather far from courageous or unfrightened or unshocked, as the German has it here. Since in fact, by the end of Sophocles' Oedipus Tyrannus, they don't see anything at all. Right? Oedipus is so horrified by his discovery that he's both committed patricide and incest that he gouges them out, right, with his mother and wife's pins in her dress. And in Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus we're told about sealed up Odysseus' ears here. Odysseus is precisely the one who doesn't seal up his ears with wax in the story, right? He puts the wax into the ears of his fellow shipmates, but he has them strap him to the mast and leave his ears open so that he can hear the siren song. And Nietzsche, of course, is a trained classicist. He knows these things, right? And he has some control over these illusions when he puts them, in fact, often quite subtle control over them, I think. So what's he doing in bringing these things up? I do think here it's important to look at the context of in which this comes up. And I mentioned this thing about cruelty. So Nietzsche famously suggests in this section, Beyond Good and Evil 230, a little bit earlier on, that human beings naturally enjoy being cruel. He says it elsewhere as well. That we cultivated moderns kind of fool ourselves into thinking we've somehow outgrown this. Our desire for cruelty has just sort of transformed in some ways. And so Nietzsche says almost everything we call higher culture is based on a spiritualization, the deepening of cruelty. The wild animal has not been killed off at all. It's alive and well. It is just, he says, become divine. That's actually in the prior section, 229. And so He makes the point here, a point he also makes elsewhere, that there's a kind of delight simply in making someone else suffer. He says there's overabundant pleasure in your own suffering too, in making yourself suffer, and that the pleasure of this self-directed cruelty can explain various phenomena that otherwise we might have thought were kind of confusing, especially phenomena within Christianity, religious self-denial of various kinds, and so on. And so, but he adds to this list of things that phenomena that might have been confusing that can be made clear with this reference to self-cruelty. He adds the drive to know, or the desire to know, the will to truth, as he sometimes calls it in other places. Since our mind or our spirit constantly tends towards semblances and surfaces. That's a direct quote. And so treating something with the depth and care required to really know it requires us to act against that tendency, actually. A tendency that Nietzsche calls the fundamental will of the spirit. So the spirit wants to play with semblances, but to know ourselves, we have to sort of push that part of ourselves down. We have to direct cruelty at it. And so he describes this at some length. I'm gonna skip over some bits here, but the main point he makes here is that the fundamental desires of a knower, somebody who's seeking to know something, the naturalist in his sense, are bound to conflict with this fundamental desire of the spirit. The knower ought to say of her motivations that there is something cruel in the tendency of my spirit, he says. The knower, just like any other spirit, seeks power, but does so by means of being cruel to the part of herself that wants simplicity, appearance, masks, evasions. Though others might laud this willingness to hurt themselves in service of the truth as a kind of brave or wild honesty, Nietzsche says that the knower actually should reject lofty moralized language like that, recognize that it's perfectly natural, if not particularly nice, to delight in this cruelty that they're doing to each other, to themselves rather, self-directed. This is what motivates them. So they're not just doing something heroic. They're doing something that is, in some senses, petty, actually, or cruel, right, in a straightforward sense. And so it's only after this that we get these references to Oedipus and Odysseus. And so we note, again, what is crucial about Oedipus's eyes. So we're supposed to be imagining Oedipus's eyes here. It's not that they look unflinchingly at the truth, but that they ultimately can't take in what they see. Right? That he knocks them out, right? He stabs his eyes. They can't take in what they see and are destroyed. This is a real possibility, I want to Nietzsche suggests, for the naturalist too, that our attempt to treat ourselves as objects of scientific knowledge might actually destroy us, or perhaps better, make us such that we don't want to look at ourselves anymore, right? We want to stab our eyes out. That implication, I think, is not something Nietzsche evades, trying to cover up or anything. It's right there. He closes Beyond Good and Evil 230 by suggesting that the task of the naturalist is strange and insane. I could bring that thing back up, but I don't want to go too long here. It's strange and insane, he says. And he suggests at the end that he doesn't have any answer necessarily to the question about why we should do it anyway. That's that ellipsis at the end of the section, right? Why should we do this if it's so strange and insane? So here, that was the second section of the paper. Here in the third section, I want to talk about Odysseus. So the absence of a reason for pursuing this project, this will to truth kind of project, it ought to trouble us and make us wonder if the call to naturalism is meant in as wholehearted a sense as these readers usually, naturalist readers usually take it to be. So I want to return to that Odysseus claim, the claim that we should face ourselves with, quote, sealed Odysseus ears, deaf to the lures of the old metaphysical bird catchers who have been telling us that our origin is different and higher than the rest of nature. The reference is strange, as I suggested, since Odysseus is the one who doesn't put wax in his ears, right? So what does it mean to have sealed Odysseus' ears? In fact, Nietzsche uses this reference to the sirens in other passages as well. I bring up one from the Gay Science, where he denigrates traditional philosophers, actually, for seeing the senses and the knowledge that senses give, or the data that the senses give us, as a siren song, such that, here I'm quoting, wax in the ear was virtually a condition of philosophizing. A true philosopher didn't listen to life insofar as life is music. He denied the music of life. It's an old philosopher's superstition that all music is siren music. So what this suggests as a way maybe out of our interpretive confusion from before, is the thought that perhaps the naturalist project, which also conceives of itself as needing wax in the ears, is insane because it too denies this music of life by being intentionally cruel to a fundamental part of ourselves. So the use of the illusion is different in the two passages, of course, but however one uses it, it only makes sense if what is being avoided is tempting, if there's something more important for which the tempting thing is being sacrificed. So in the case of Odysseus, he places such a high value on getting home, right, that not yielding to the siren song is worthwhile. Right? What's wrong with the philosophers in the gay science passage is that they sacrifice the senses for something that is not worthwhile enough, at least, to give up the other thing, their ideals, which in Nietzsche's mind are nothing. Does the naturalist do the same in the Beyond Good and Evil passage? That's my question. And so I would argue that she does. That Nietzsche gives us plenty of arguments elsewhere as to why himself. He suggests in Beyond Good and Evil 230 that the naturalistic seeker after truth sacrifices that fundamental will of her spirit, its will to power, that manifests itself in the drive to assimilate new experiences, to interpret them playfully, to take delight in surfaces, masks, and simplifications. It gets rid of that because this drive is inimical to the drive for truth, which needs careful and rigorous kind of reflection. But what does this commitment to truth amount to? We've already seen that the free-spirited philosopher Nietzsche portrays himself as in Beyond Good and Evil 230 has a difficult time answering this question straightforwardly. Why do this at all? When Nietzsche talks about this issue explicitly in another passage from Gay Science, a very famous one, Gay Science 344, he argues that unconditional commitment to the truth in fact bottoms out in the moral command not to deceive, not even oneself, and that the command is grounded in a kind of metaphysical faith. That faith, he warns, might not be in the service of life, that it might be actually a kind of will to death, he says, since truth is only sometimes useful to us. Charitably interpreted, I'm quoting him here, he says, the will to truth might perhaps be a quixotism, a slight enthusiastic folly, but it could also be something worse, namely a principle that is hostile to life and destructive. Will to truth, that could be a hidden will to death. So this theme is again sounded in at the close of the genealogy. Nietzsche suggests there that modern, secularized, purely scientific search for truth is in fact the most insidious development of the ascetic ideal, which he had been talking about in the rest of that essay and said was part of Christianity. There he suggests that if one wants to really find an enemy of that ascetic ideal, one should actually look to art, not to science. So I should stop there. I don't claim here to be sort of giving a full interpretation of what Nietzsche's conception of the value of truth is, or of naturalism. But I hope to have suggested here that the passage at least suggests that Nietzsche's highly ambivalent about it. He doesn't have obvious answers to the question about why we want truth, and that he's raising it as a serious problem for modern people going forward. And the answer to that question is by no means sort of settled in advance by science. So that's all. I hope I haven't gone too far over.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jordan. As we discussed with the speakers at the beginning, we're going to present both papers first and then open up for questions at the end. So with no further ado, I will turn to Charlie Gustafson-Barret and her paper on Woman versus Superman on the nature of Nietzsche's great stupidity. Well, thank you to both of our speakers for obviously fascinating papers. I had the pleasure of reading them ahead of time. I'm not sure if any of the rest of you managed to do that. I've prepared some questions for the speakers and I've shared them with the speakers ahead of time. I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pick one for each of you and then just open it up because I don't want my pre-prepared questions to dominate anything here. So having now heard your presentations again, I think I know which ones I want to ask. So Jordan, for you, I'd like to focus on the second one that I had sent to you. And so one of the things that I'd specifically liked about your paper is the reminder that Nietzsche was so interested in the relationship between art and science. Of course, that begins with his Apollonian Dionysian in Birth of Tragedy and goes all the way through. That he sometimes sees them as oppositional, sometimes parasitic, sometimes symbiotic from his earliest works. And by this point, he's presenting art as a kind of an antidote. As you note, he suggests in the genealogy that the purely scientific search for truth is in fact the most insidious development of the ascetic ideal that had motivated Christianity all along. If one really wants to find an enemy of that ascetic ideal, one should look not to science, but to art. And so my question about that is that, as he often does, Nietzsche seems to be enacting the very thing that he recommends in recommending it, turning to art, to the myths and the symbols of Oedipus and Odysseus, to deflect the cruelty of the naturalist's scientific program. But in doing so, isn't he revealing the truth of the matter? The truth of the naturalist's motivation, the inevitable end of the naturalist's project. So isn't he using art to pursue and reveal truth, rather than to cushion and avoid it? Or is that another intentional irony?
Yeah, so I'm sad you're not going to ask the first one. Maybe we'll get to the first one later, because I was like, as you were saying that, I was like, I hope she picks the first one. I hope she picks the first one. But the second one's interesting too. But yeah, so it's a great question. And I mean, of course, the way Nietzsche puts that sort of art as the antidote to truth thing in the genealogy explicitly mentions Homer. And of course, the Odysseus example here comes from Homer. And I think it's exactly the right question to ask here. I think part of what I'd want to say here is that a big, really what's most important to me, I think, about figuring out this conception of naturalism according to Nietzsche is the emphasis that's put on control. And that's part of why I thought Leiter's position was interesting and why I start with it, that the motivation for looking at human beings in this way is that we can control them. We have control over the phenomena now if we understand their causal determinants and so on. And so I think it may be, of course it is true in some sense or other, that art can reveal truth. Of course, Nietzsche is at pains sometimes to suggest that it does the opposite, right? That it puts semblances over things and that it actually hides the truth or sugarcoats it maybe in some cases or makes it palatable to us. But it's true that it can be revelatory as well. I think Nietzsche recognizes that even if he doesn't focus on it maybe as much as he should. But if it does in a way that is out of the person's control who is using it in that way, I think. Art is more revelatory than you think it will be in advance. And that's part of what it means, I think, probably for it to be art. And that's not true of science, right? Or at least of this model of science, of course. Maybe Nietzsche's wrong about science, or Leiter is too, or whatever. And so the incorporation of those allusions to Oedipus and Odysseus, part of what I was doing there is suggesting maybe that Nietzsche's thought through some of these thoughts that I'm putting forward, right? That he's thought about what it means for a naturalist to have unshocked Oedipus eyes and sealed up Odysseus ears. But part of that inevitably, I think, is going to end up being my own interpretation of those things, developing the metaphor a bit further, perhaps than Nietzsche did, or in different ways, perhaps than Nietzsche did. That's exactly what invoking Oedipus and Odysseus opens up as a possibility to do that kind of thing. And so he is trying to reveal a kind of truth about them. I think it's a truth that's about something more ambiguous about what the value of the will to truth is. But precisely by doing, as you say, by enacting it as he says it, I think he is showing to us that he's not fully going to be in control of the truth that he opens up in that way. I'll be curious to see what Charlie maybe thinks of that too, because it sounds like we both have sort of, it seems, our reading Beyond Good and Evil is sort of more is going on in it perhaps than Nietzsche fully has control over. I don't know, maybe she wouldn't agree with that, but that's, I think the issue of control is a big one here for me, that's central to the naturalistic project as Nietzsche conceives it, and that's a part of the reason why he's always resisting it.
Charlie, would you like to? Definitely want to open it up to the rest of the panel or people. So please. Questions? Melvin?
Well, first I'd like to say this is the second time that Charlie has come to MSA and given an energetic, eloquent paper that left me panting along behind. And I should have read, if I'd known, I would have read it in advance, because that's what I had to do after the last one. So I would like, I want to set a problem that might both respond to, and that is, what could Nietzsche do about Oedipus at Colonus?
Could you explain what you mean by that question?
Well, we have Oedipus. I mean, Oedipus was not done with, all right, in Oedipus Rex. He reappears, as he did for his author at the end of his life. And he recognizes that he wasn't guilty. And then there's a kind of apotheosis. All right, he walks into the grove, and it then becomes sacred ground.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And I just wonder, Nietzsche's, I'm sure he was aware of that play. It's a really startling play because the argument, Creon comes back in and tries to haul him off so he will make Thebes the sacred ground and so on. It's an extraordinary reversal, which, I mean, it's probably a bad example since I've had to remind you of the unfolding of it, but it is a kind of, because he said, look, it's a major, even for Greek thought, because he says, look, I didn't know that was my mother. I didn't know that was my father. Right?
Yeah.
And so how could I be guilty?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this is a major move in a way, because blood guilt was blood guilt up to this point in Greek thought.
You're remembering that as more redemptive than I had, but Jordan?
Maybe I'll say something here. You started talking about Charlie, but it sounds like it's a question more directed at mine. If Charlie disagrees, of course.
Yeah, I thought it would be. Take
it away, Jordan.
Yeah, go ahead.
It was helpful to be reminded of the details. I have read Oedipus at Colonus, but it has been a while. And like Kendy, I remembered it a little less obviously redemptive, although there are those elements there as well. From a kind of background perspective, Nietzsche certainly knew. I mean, he lectured about Oedipus at Colonus when he was working at the university, and in Birth of Tragedy, when this story comes up, it's clear that he's got that bigger arc in mind and not just Oedipus Rex.
Yeah.
So he would have had it in mind for sure. And I don't know what to say about it here necessarily. I mean, the way you're suggesting it, which is one reading of it, is that it pushes that it's part of what Sophocles is doing there, is pushing the Greeks in a way sort of more toward a what would be to us a more recognizable conception of moral responsibility and accountability, right? I didn't know, therefore I can't be held responsible for. Whereas for the most part, it seems like in a lot of what Nietzsche writes elsewhere, he's pretty critical of that model of moral responsibility, at least as it gets, taken up by Christian and more modern thinkers later on. And he is interested precisely, it seems like, about the Greeks, that they didn't have that model of moral responsibility, that it can be that your life is sort of destroyed by something that in some sense or other you couldn't help but have done. Yeah. And so he sees the kind of tragedy of human life in that. So I don't know. You're right that Oedipus at Colonus, I mean, there's some sense or other there of that he's got a kind of dignity in retrospect there that he gains after the fact. I don't know how to, and I don't know how to apply that to what I've been saying about Oedipus. But if others have suggestions, that'd be great.
Well, let me just add.
I'm talking around your question more than actually addressing it.
Okay. No, I was really quite intrigued. Let me just add. Am I still be heard?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's a wonderful BBC production that you can find online with singularly great actors and actresses that was made along with the Antigone, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. So you can recover it very easily and with great delight.
All right, I will.
Yeah.
Richard, you wanted to pick up on that?
Well, I just want to mention, because I just happened to have The Birth of Tragedy available to me here in translation. And this is not like it's not my attempt to answer the question. I'm just pointing to the fact that Oedipus at Colonus is discussed briefly in section 9.
Oh, really?
Of The Birth of Tragedy. It's in a passage where, I'm just reading this quickly, I'm gathering that it's a passage that's characterizing the intent of Sophocles in not just Oedipus at Colonus, but Oedipus Rex as well, the intent of Sophocles to present a kind of redemptive vision. So the noble human being who is destined for error and misery despite his wisdom, but who in the end, through his enormous suffering, exerts on the world around him a magical, beneficent force, remains effective even after his death. And then a bit further down, he expressly mentions Oedipus at Colonus. Says, we encounter this same serenity in Oedipus at Colonus, but here it is elevated into infinite transfiguration. And then goes on from there. So, I mean, if you look there, you might find something that is helpful. I'm not claiming that I've it contributed to this dispute at all. I'm just
no. I think it's helpful. It's. I mean, I think you see the ambivalence there a little bit too. I mean, one thing to remember is that, at least at the time of that book, like Aeschylus is the real model for Nietzsche of like pure no chaser tragedy, and Sophocles is still respected, but to some degree kind of a step in a different direction from that. And so I think it's right that there's that, he does focus on that redemptive element, but he doesn't, I don't think, come down one way or the other about whether that's a sort of good thing or not. I don't know. I don't know.
Yes. I think that's really helpful what Charlie said, that what seems to be humility is actually a standpoint beyond morality, a standpoint beyond good and evil. And it's in this same passage that Nietzsche talks about the breaking of the rigid law of individuation in tragedy and the dissolution of nature in one's own person. So, I mean, there's this necessary moment of destruction and dissolution that has nothing to do with morality. Mm-hmm. I think maybe we shouldn't call that humility. It's what is involved in the suffering that the hero must go through. And this contains that famous metaphor of having images of light after gazing into the abyss, which is like a kind of an interesting reversal of the Platonic cave. The light emerges through the abyss, through the breakdown of moral order, of what we would tend to consider the good. Mm-hmm. But I shouldn't go on because I'm not prepared to make any comments on this. But I'm drawing partly upon my memory of the book and the recovery of this particular passage.
Yeah, maybe I'll, because I want to see what Charlie thinks about that. I too sort of balked a bit at that use of the term humility. I wonder if you could say something in defense of that. So why should we couch it particularly in terms of humility rather than, as Richard seemed to be suggesting, kind of just a suffering one has to sort of go through, submit to, or I don't know. Why particularly humility?
Yeah.
And actually it's 12:45, which I believe is the end of our session.
Okay.
So I don't want to kick anybody out, but I know there's other panels and people have other events. So I wanted to mark that and let people take this moment to thank our speakers once again for 2 excellent papers. Yay. All right. And thank you all for joining us.
All right. Thanks.